We had some ideas about how the season was going to go, but then this happened.
On this Friday night, Secretary of State Marco Rubio now ordering the U.S. to immediately stop almost all foreign aid and supplies.
USAID was dismantled on Trump's order, even though it was mandated by Congress and its funding was required by law.
Decades, the United States has been the largest single donor of aid globally, and last year it provided more than 40% of the UN's humanitarian aid budget.
Billionaire Elon Musk announced President Trump had agreed with him to shut the agency. USAID staffers...
The Trump administration ordered a pause to most U.S. foreign aid till late April. Thousands of projects are at risk of elimination, and nearly all staff from the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, are on administrative leave. There are lawsuits challenging these decisions, including a judge late Thursday temporarily ordering the resumption of aid that began before January 20th. But one thing is certain: USAID is taking a big hit. So how did we get to this moment? What's been the impact of the American foreign aid freeze so far, including on women and girls? And where does the gender equality movement go from here? I'm Rena Ninan, and in this season of the Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, we're following the U.S. foreign aid news. In this episode, you'll hear a conversation that we taped at the Munich Security Conference about the economic and security implications of this aid freeze. The conversation was moderated by Foreign Policy's editor-in-chief, Ravi Agrawal. He spoke with Ndidi Wuneli, president and CEO of the One Campaign, and Umi Harun Mohammed, a member of parliament in Kenya.
So we have a great opportunity here to talk about why aid matters, what is happening to the aid infrastructure globally, which is very much in the news. And then lastly, I want to move us towards what the aid community and the world can do to make up for that loss that we're seeing filter through the system already. I have two wonderful guests. Ndidi, let me start with you. And I think it's worth just talking through a little bit. Why does aid matter?
Well, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think aid matters because we have vulnerability across our world. There are conflicts linked to climate change, economic crisis, ethnic disputes, power struggles, and those gaps have to be filled. Now, it's really critical for health, for economic stability, but also for the necessary world humanity and community that we all belong to. We are connected as a humanity, and that aid is a way to show that in times of need, you can step in. Germany really was rebuilt by aid after the World War. I mean, we talk about the Marshall Plan. This is an example of an economy that rose again, following support from its neighbors, following support from the world. And that's the same thing. In fact, we just launched a campaign, and if you'll indulge me, I'm going to give both of you a $103 bill.
Oh, thank you.
And we have enough for the audience. And if you turn the bill around, it says that for every dollar spent on activities that's for economic growth and political stability, we can avert spending of 103 on future conflicts. One's data just revealed that the global economy in 2023, because of conflict, spent over $190 trillion. Now, if we can avert conflict, which is where aid is so critical for economic growth, for stability, for healthy lives, then you can ensure stability, which creates peace for all of us. We've been talking in previous panels about pandemics, epidemics, conflicts. We're sitting here in the Munich Security Conference. Aid averts this if it's used appropriately, and it has a direct return on investment on our economic growth as a humanity, our stability, and our continued prosperity. And so for me, I'm a big believer that when used wisely for the right things, aid transforms our ecosystems.
I have to say, I don't think I've ever heard a better 2-minute explanation for why aid matters. And not only that, with a prop as well. Umi, talk to us a little bit, just from your perspective in Kenya, how you've seen aid make a difference and potentially what the loss of it would mean.
I mean, I can't help to take note that she's consistently insisted on if aid is used properly. And I think that's where the conversation should be, because it's not about how much aid do we have, but how exactly are we using the funding that is coming to different countries for different support. In Kenya, many among the fundings, including the PEPFAR, is one of the budgets that are used to support patients with HIV and AIDS. We are looking at a population of 1 million people in Kenya who are currently, at a distressful situation because most of the funding came from the USAID, and we're coming up to do our budgets sometime in June, and we have to actually sit down and structure a way that we prioritize a lot of health and healthcare budgets that will be affected because of the funding cut that we are having. We have the.
I ask you if you can quantify the cut. How much is it worth?
I mean, it was close to 2 billion shillings that were coming to the PEPFAR. The Global Fund also used to give a donation of up to 3 billion for the mosquito and the malaria funding programs. And Kenya is actually one of the biggest beneficiaries. We are looking at, I think in Africa alone, over 2.3 million children who will be affected by the funding, because malaria is one of among the leading rates in child death and mortality issues. So, of course, it's a challenge, but I think as a Kenyan politician, I'm looking at it as a chance for Kenyans, and not just Kenyans, but African countries to actually start looking into reorganizing their budgets, because we've come from far. We've had conflict in some areas, but in the Eastern African region and the East Africa region where I come from, we've enjoyed some sort of improvement and stability, and we've really benefited from a lot of aid programs. But now is a chance for us to actually restructure so that then you don't have to entirely rely on aid, because what happens when the funding freezes, like what we are actually facing currently. So, of course, it's a challenge, but I look at it as a chance to reevaluate, because a lot of money ends up being misappropriated when you have the confidence that, there's some donor money that will come in that can take care of HIV, can take care of malaria, can take care of food. In 2018, WFP withdrew officially from the school feeding program in Kenya. That didn't mean that children went hungry. It just meant that the government of Kenya sat down to prioritize school feeding and were able to inject up to 6 billion shillings. So those are the situations that we are looking at.
Sure.
Could this be a chance for us to improve?
Right.
Yeah.
Indeed, now that with USAID's cuts, we were listening to the Kenyan side of the story, but at a macro level for Africa, what is the impact going to look like?
So I'd first say that the way that it's been done has been very abrupt and disruptive.
Yeah.
And that has created massive uncertainty, some form of panic, not just in Africa, but in DC, where I happen to live.
Yeah.
And quite a bit of waste already.
Yeah.
In fact, $90 billion worth of HIV medication is being held up somewhere, and it will expire if it's not distributed. So we are convinced that we need to be on a pathway to sustainability. And that pathway has to be well-structured, systematic, well thought out, and involve partners across the board. When I first took on this job, that was a very clear question Lindsey Graham asked me: when will PEPFAR end? PEPFAR has been one of the most successful interventions by the Republican Party under Bush. Saved 26 million lives. There's an ROI on PEPFAR. So yes, there has to be an end. When PEPFAR was started, it cost $10,000 to treat someone who had HIV. Today it's $40. And the truth is that in many African countries, the African portion of that cost is up to 70 or 80%. So there's no country that is completely dependent on PEPFAR funds. There's a pathway. Now, that pathway is what we believe at the One Campaign. We have to work in partnership with Africans and our G7 countries to ensure that we do it in a smooth way that doesn't disrupt too many lives. So my first message is, it is critical we do not disrupt what has been started. The soft power that we're discussing today is so important at this critical time in geopolitical unrest in our world. And we need to ensure that we sustain trust. You don't break trust by abruptly stopping something. You gradually persuade. But to my sister's point, I just came from Addis this morning. I was in Addis for the African Union meetings. And yesterday, I was in a room with 8 African presidents and ministers of finance, leaders from Gavi and Global Fund and others. And it was so heartwarming to hear African presidents say, we have a wake-up call, we are taking full responsibility for our citizens, and we're going to be partnering across the continent to make sure that we invest in local manufacturing for vaccines, for drugs, building out the infrastructure, reducing waste, and ensuring transparency and accountability. So I actually left Addis encouraged that there's leadership on the ground that recognizes this is an opportune time to do things differently, in collaboration with each other and in collaboration with partners that are key to this transformation.
So that sounds great for the future, because aid is never a long-term strategy, it's a shorter-term strategy, and if you can transition out to a better local model, nothing like it, but there is a short-term disruption. And Umi, let me bring you back in here. How do you think, given what you just heard about African countries getting together to invest their own money, how quickly do you think something like that could fill the gap left by USAID, for example?
I think it won't be something that will happen immediately, because that means there are countries that have already done their fiscal budgets for the year, meaning they cannot just have some money lying extra to come and support. So that will be a challenge. And if you look at the numbers, we will be having increased rates of HIV/AIDS among especially young adolescent girls, women and girls who are benefiting from the PEPFAR program. We would be having, numerous problems. But in the long term, like you said, aid is not sustainable. But in the short term, it would mean that the challenges will still be there. And it's about what exactly can we have as a plan B, because USAID is not the only funding that has been, coming up to support these programs. We have the European funding that is available, but still there'll be shortfalls, especially in Kenya. The currency, I'm a bit worried, because a lot of the programs were funded by the USAID. They're actually, regions, cities within the city that have come up because of the USAID programs, especially around the embassy areas. So that leaves you with the question of how can this affect the Kenya shilling, for example, or currencies for other regions within Africa. So I think it might be a challenge. It's something that was not expected, but that just is a wake-up call, because how many times can we suffer from impulse decisions that will be made by countries like, the US, especially with the current president? You can never know where you stand.
Yeah. Indeed, it strikes me that, you began this discussion by giving us this $103 note, and it's memorable. I'm going to remember this. But it also reminds me of how a lot of us have been thinking of President Trump in the United States as quote-unquote transactional. And I'm guessing there's a reason why you were presenting this note as a transaction, basically, that aid is a transaction, but it's a transaction that pays off. Now, in a transactional world that we now seem to be entering, are there other countries that are going to take on this very example that you just showed us? Is it China or an India or an African country going to take up the mantle of investing that gap that the US has now created?
Well, I think it's a unique time in our history. We have seen China play a long game by investing in infrastructure on the African continent over the last 20 years. We've seen trade with China increase exponentially. But we also have seen growing interest from the Middle East, growing interest from other players in Asia, and many African countries actually stepping up. My challenge at this time, and I think I agree with my sister, Madam Mohammed, is the importance of mutually beneficial relationships built on transparency, accountability, and respect. And I think there's a new bargain, a new paradigm shift that we need when we engage with the African continent. It's no longer what does the world think Africa needs, but what Africans are demanding at this time from the world. And I think there's a unique opportunity for Europe. It's not by chance that we're sitting here in Germany. Germany has played an important role historically in terms of engaging with Africa and committing to Gavi, the Global Fund, IDA. Those are very important partnerships, and Germany has been a leader. And we believe that even with the leadership transition that will happen next week, that we're calling on Germany to play that role. We're calling on France to play that role. We're calling on the EU leadership to play that role. And today, sitting with some EU leaders, we talked about the cost of capital and the fact that when you're investing in Africa, yes, aid is one piece that grants funding, but there's a place for concessional financing, for catalytic capital, for pension fund money, for de-risking instruments, because you can have mutually beneficial growth.
And to be clear, This isn't just charity, this is an investment.
It's an investment. And so that's what we are calling for Europe. And European investment banks and the European Development Funds and the DFI sitting in Europe have an important role to play to fill that gap. And we've seen KFWs of the world and AFDs and BII from the UK stepping in and making strategic investments that are mutually beneficial. And we want to see more catalytic capital to drive growth. Because when economies grow, then they can address it. But two other issues. The cost of capital is an issue. There's a risk premium that is placed on investing in Africa, and it's unacceptable. Oftentimes, Africans are paying 500% more for catalytic capital for debt. And through the G20 and South Africa hosting it, the One Campaign is pushing for a review of this risk premium that Africa pays. The second is the debt burden, which is really linked to the risk premium. We've paid for very expensive debt, and it's crippling our economies. And countries are paying more in debt repayments. There's more money leaving Africa that's coming in. So these are critical to this discussion as we transition in this pathway to sustainability. And we are convinced you can't look at one issue without looking at the rest of the spectrum of issues that will drive growth.
And of course, unsaid in this is Europe and America's history in Africa, which is very much part of that puzzle, because it wouldn't be this way without
Exactly.
Umi, let me bring you back in. As we think about the positive case for investing in Africa, when you come to a place like this, the Munich Security Conference, and you have world leaders listening to you, what do you say? What is the case for long-term investment? And in as much as there are challenges of historic debt, but also debt financing, again, how do you convince them?
I mean, I think I agree with what my colleague has said. Aid is not a charity, rather an investment. We are looking at a population of 1.5 billion people, especially with Africa being one of the leading holders of the minerals, I think around 40 to 50% of the world's mineral. So you can't look at such a continent from the perspective of aid or just charity, but exactly how do we come in as partnership, not just in terms of finances, but even in the human resource. And the global immigration is a crisis, not just within Africa, but largely over the world. So this is a chance, I think, for me as Africa to just not just sit down, but re-strategize, see exactly how we're able to partner with other global leaders. And today is a significant day because we were just having the African Union elections. Sadly, Kenya, we lost the seat because we're fronting one of our opposition candidates. But we believe that even with the Djibouti candidate, we'll be able to actually prioritize agendas that are of interest to Africa. Exactly how can we leverage from the resources that we have as we look at the global agendas and the things that are happening the world over. How exactly can Africa be looked at as a partner and not just as a region that is benefiting from just aid, because at some point when you come to the table, you need to be able to show what resources you have, and that is non-negotiable for us. So sitting in this Munich conference, of course, the conversations mostly centered on Europe, but Africa still has a role to play, and as a young leader, I think this is a chance for us to move forward and be able to give priorities to things that are of need. And even as we discuss the issues of soft power and the foreign aid and the charity and the freeze, I think this is a chance that we are able to prioritize what's important, because most of the time localization hasn't been actualized. You get funding that is coming to Africa through institutions, but 50% remains within the institutions without reaching the grassroots. So could this be a chance that we're also able to pick up conversations on localization? How can we bring in young people to be able to lead conversations, for example, on peace? How could we be able to allow innovations to take the center stage so that we're able to have local solutions to local problems? Thank you.
And of course, demographics. As much of the Western world gets older, it is places like Africa that have the dynamism of youth, that have the numbers on their side, and essentially the future on their side. But Ndidi, in our final minute or so, much of this conversation, again, has been transactional, in part because we seem to have given up on soft power. Is that the right strategy, by the way?
I'm still a big believer in the power of humanity to act together for critical issues. We've seen the world rally around Ukraine at a critical time in its history, right? We need to ensure that we don't have a double standard with other world regions. We need to ensure that we realize that equity and justice are what connects us as humanity, and that none of us are equal until all of us are equal. I'm still a big believer in that. That's why I'm here at the Munich Security Conference. And I believe that the connection between security and soft power and sustainability are unequivocal. We need each other, and we need to work together for a future that we all deserve. And it's not just about our generation, it's for future generations, because they will hold us accountable for the decisions we take today.
I couldn't agree with you more. Soft power is the only longer-term game in town. I'll also say soft power is a term that was coined in Foreign Policy magazine.
I love it.
Many, many years ago. Ndidi, Umi, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much.
You just heard Foreign Policy's editor-in-chief Ravi Agrawal in conversation with Ndidi Wuneli, president and CEO of the One Campaign, and Umi Harun Mohammed, a member of parliament in Kenya. They discuss the impact of the U.S. foreign aid pause in Africa. Beyond their incredible work, both these guests have a special connection to the podcast. Ndidi was on Hero in the first season, and Umi Mohammed was the runner-up on a reality TV show called Miss President, which we covered in Season 5. And that does it for today's show. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is hosted by me, Rena Ninen. Laura Rossbrow-Tellem is our senior producer. Rob Sachs, our managing director. The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women is a production of Foreign Policy and is supported by the Gates Foundation and the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in your feed in 2 weeks.